How was your Monday? Did you notice climate change? If you did not, you're living under a rock, because it doesn't matter which part of the world you're watching us from, you're witnessing one of these. Heat waves, floods, typhoons, wildfires. Every part of the world is suffering. And most of us seem blasé about it. Tonight we'll discuss why. Also bring you a special report on a military threat. America is building what's being called a wall of defense against China. 2 strings of islands, heavily militarized, within striking distance of the Dragon. Israel is using artificial intelligence in military operations. How safe is it? The United Nations Security Council is meeting to discuss the risks of AI. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine has frozen. Neither side seems to be making gains. So where is this going? We'll bring you an assessment. Why is Pakistan in a hurry to outsource an airport? How is the saffron trade of Kashmir blooming? What does democracy cost in America? Looking at Biden's campaign funding. And all about this year's Wimbledon. First up, the headlines. More trouble for the Chinese economy. It's growing slower than expected. Youth joblessness hit a record high of 21.3% in June. China's economy officially grew by 3% in 2022, one of its weakest showings in decades. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is in India. She says India and America are among the closest partners in the world. She's in Gujarat to attend a G20 meeting. Yellen also met India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman on the sidelines of the G20 meet. Iran's morality police resumes patrols after 10 months. Tehran announces a new campaign to force women to wear the headscarf. The police had pulled back after the death of Masha Amini. The 22-year-old's death last September had led to nationwide protests. Norway to fine Meta $1 million. The fine is over privacy breaches and harvesting user data. Meta can avoid this fine by taking remedial action. Norway will start charging the $1 million fine every day from the 4th of August unless Meta acts. And a mysterious object has been found on an Australian beach. Police warn the public to stay away from the huge cylinder found in Western Australia. The copper-coloured cylinder looks damaged. Police will remove the object after determining its origin. If you Google China today, 9 out of 10 headlines will talk about its economy. Growth below expectations, sinking property prices, and impending slowdown. That's all that the world is talking about. But none of this has stopped China from targeting Taiwan. The provocations continue. Last week, China sent fighter jets, bombers, and warships towards Taiwan. Over the course of 3 days, more than 70 Chinese planes crossed the median line. This is the de facto border between Taiwan and China, the median line. As the threat grows, the world is talking about possible scenarios, and all of these scenarios feature the U.S. What will America do to contain China? Will it go to war with China over Taiwan? What is America's military strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan? These questions are being asked. Tonight we have some answers. Tonight we want to tell you about what's being called America's wall of defense. This is in the waters around Taiwan. The U.S. is arming allies and building military presence. To understand this wall of defense, let's first understand the lay of the land. This is the region we're talking about, East Asia, already heavily militarized with a sizable presence of U.S. forces. Starting with South Korea. South Korea has about 73 U.S. bases and more than 26,000 American soldiers. Then we have Japan, and double the numbers. Japan has 120 American bases with more than 50,000 U.S. troops. And these are the larger deployments. But U.S. military presence is not limited to these countries. There are bases in the Philippines, Cambodia, Singapore, Brunei, and Guam, which again is a large hub. Guam has about 8,000 U.S. troops. If you connect these dots, you'll see that the Americans have more than a foothold in the region. But that may not be enough to contain China. At least that is Washington's assessment. It remains worried about China's moves. Look at what their latest defense strategy says. It calls China the quote-unquote most comprehensive and serious challenge to the U.S. I have a copy of that report. Let me quote from what it says. The PRC is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. This is the American assessment. The U.S. recognizes the threat posed by China. The question is, what will they do about it? From what we understand, the US military strategy has two parts. Part one is arming allies, and part two is getting access to more bases. And this plan is already being executed. Take the case of Japan. There is complete shift in its defense posture, a complete shift there. Japan is dumping its pacifist credentials. It is preparing for war with American weapons. Let me show you how. Japan is building a chain of militarized islands. It is loading them with military hardware and facilities. Take a look at this one. It's an island called Ishigaki. Recently, Japan built a garrison here. In March 2023, it also made an announcement. Japan was sending more than 500 members of the Ground Self-Defense Force. Now, that's their version of an army. Japan technically does not have an army. Their constitution does not allow it. They want to change it, but as of today, what they have is something called a self-defense force. It can only be used for defense. It cannot participate in an attack or an offensive operation. But as Japan shifts away from pacificism, its forces are beginning to look like a real army. The troops in Ishigaki, for instance, are being armed. They're getting 150 military vehicles and land-to-ship and land-to-air missile units. Also, America's Patriot missile system. Then we have another island called Yonaguni. It has about 160 Japanese troops. In April this year, they too got a Patriot missile system. Same with the island of Miyako. It has, in fact, the same missile defense system, plus an entire military base with 700 to 800 troops. And anti-ship surface-to-air missile batteries. Also radar and intelligence gathering facilities. Another island, called Amami Oshima, has similar deployments. Earlier this year, Japan started work on yet another island called Mageshima. Tokyo is building a military base here as well, and I have some pictures. This is what the island of Mageshima looks like. Reports say a military base is being built here. It will be used by the US military for aircraft training. A pre-existing base will be relocated here. There will be new runways, a control tower, and an explosives depot. It will be a full-fledged military facility for the US military. Now look how close it is to Taiwan and the Chinese borders. The goal is quite clear, to be within striking distance of China. In fact, the US is getting access to more bases in the region. Recently, it struck a deal with the Philippines. It got access to 4 more bases. 3 on the island of Luzon, which is close to Taiwan, and 1 in Palawan. This is in the South China Sea. Now, in case you're wondering what America will do with so many bases, let me show you. This is what they're building. America's wall of defense against China. This is what it looks like. 2 chains of interconnected islands, starting from Japan and South Korea in the north to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea in the south. These 2 island chains are supposed to deter China. And this is not a new idea, by the way. It was first proposed in the year 1951 by John Foster Dulles. He later became the US Secretary of State. Some 70 years back, Dulles proposed the island chain strategy. Back then, the objective was to contain both the Soviet Union and China. He wanted a string of naval bases in the Pacific to restrict access to the sea, both for Moscow and Beijing. And now, all these decades later, that plan is being revived. It may or may not work. But China will see this as encirclement, an attempt at containment, which is what it is. So expect Beijing to react sharply. In fact, it's a bit of a catch-22 situation for the world. These attempts to prevent a war might end up provoking one. So America is drawing a line in the ocean. It's their line of defense against China, military defense. But what about financial defense? That could be trickier. China is the only serious threat to America's military power. But their economic power is a different story altogether. Everyone wants a piece of it. And their biggest target, the US dollar. By the way, India is on the same mission, to reduce its dependence on the US dollar. Instead, India wants to use the rupee. And on Saturday, that mission got a huge boost. Prime Minister Modi was in the UAE for an official visit. After the talks, both sides made an announcement. They decided to establish a system to trade in local currencies, basically a rupee dirham trade. How would that work? Well, normally, bilateral trade is done in US dollars. It's widely accepted all over the world. It's backed by the US economy, and it's easy to exchange the dollar. So buying and selling with the US dollar makes sense. But India and the UAE are planning to remove the dollar from this equation. So Indian importers will be able to buy using rupees and Emirati importers will be able to buy in dirhams. How does it help us? For starters, you won't use up a lot of your reserves. Those dollars can be safe in your bank. So more forex stability. And secondly, things will be less volatile. Your import bill will no longer depend on the US dollar, which is the situation right now. If the dollar rises, so will your import expenditure. Your bill goes up. You end up paying more for the same thing. The rupee-dirham trade can reduce this volatility. The dollar's tantrums won't affect you, at least not as much. And India is pushing this strategy with multiple partners. Banks from 18 countries have opened special accounts in India. These include Germany, the UK, Israel, Malaysia, and Russia. So the system is very much in place. The question is how many countries are using it. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have expressed interest. So has Indonesia now. Their finance minister is in India for G20 talks. Both countries are looking at creating a rupiah trade. Rupiah is the currency of Indonesia. Indian officials say African and Gulf nations are also keen on the rupee. The key is to translate this interest into deals, to sign more local currency agreements with various countries. But that's easier said than done. Look at the rupee-ruble trade, for instance. India and Russia wanted to trade in their own currencies, the rupee and the ruble. Politically, it made sense. But financially, it did not. We buy a lot from Russia, but the Russians don't buy as much from us. So Moscow would have ended up with a huge pile of unusable rupees, which is why the talks are stalled. But India is not giving up. This deal with the UAE could be the boost that the rupee needs. And there are three reasons for that. One, there's a lot of money at stake. India-UAE trade is almost $85 billion. It is growing at 20% annually. So $100 billion is not really far off. Now, even if some of this trade is done in rupees, it will be a lot of money. Reason number two, the fuel bill. UAE is India's fourth biggest source of oil. They sell around 200,000 barrels per day. Imagine if we could buy all of that oil in rupees. Think about how much we could save in dollar reserves. And reason number three, the remittance factor. Around 3 million Indians live in the UAE. They have to send money back home. The rupee-dirham trade could help them by reducing the transaction cost, by reducing the settlement time, meaning you can send money faster and at better rates. And I know all of this sounds wonderful, but like with the ruble, there are challenges. You see, India has a huge trade deficit with the UAE, around $15 billion, which means we buy a lot more than we sell them. Most of it is oil. So will the UAE agree to using the rupee? Or will they also backtrack like Russia? And that is a big concern. There's some good news on that front, though. I mentioned that India has a trade deficit with the UAE. That was not always the case. Between 2014 and 2017, India, in fact, had a trade surplus with them. We sold more than we bought. So the goal is to reach that level again. Then the UAE will be more than happy, in fact, to take the rupee. And things are looking good on that front. They're on the right trajectory. India and the UAE signed a free trade agreement last year. Experts say Indian exports are set to double by 2027. If that happens, the rupee-dirham trade could also flourish. But what about beyond the UAE? This is where things get a bit tricky. Ideally, India would want to use rupees when there is a deficit, because they can save dollar reserves. But those countries are not always willing. Case in point, Russia. Then you have countries with a trade surplus like Bangladesh or Nepal or Sri Lanka. Those countries are more than willing to use local currencies, but in these cases, India may not agree. Take Bangladesh, for example. Their exports to India are around $2 billion, but their imports are around $14 billion. So Bangladesh's deficit with India is $12 billion. Now, assume this trade was done in rupees and takas, the Bangladeshi currency, taka. Will India be willing to accept $14 billion worth of Bangladeshi takas? We only need $2 billion for trade. What will we do with the rest? That's the problem with trading in local currency. You need to strike deals with dozens of countries, some with deficits, some with a surplus. Only then can you internationalize the rupee. New Delhi has certainly scored a big win by getting the UAE on board, but the key is to build on this momentum. That's the story of Russia's invasion. More than 500 days compressed into a few seconds. It tells you the whole story. Ukraine launched a major counterattack last year. They had some success. They liberated areas in the south and the east. But that was in November 2022. Since then, very little has changed. I know the famous Russian winter has not arrived yet, but the front lines are frozen. So what are both sides doing? They're betting on unconventional attacks. We saw one in Crimea today. This important bridge between Russia and Crimea was attacked. It is called the Kerch Bridge. 2 blasts were reported early on Monday. Russia says 2 people were killed. They have blamed Ukraine and the West for this attack. And what has Ukraine said? Well, nothing so far. It's been their strategy since last year's counteroffensive, either reject or ignore Russia. Today's attack led to traffic disruptions on the bridge. It's a key route between Russia and Crimea. Without it, moving supplies becomes difficult. So the bridge has strategic value, and this is the second time the Kerch Bridge has been attacked. The first was in October 2022. Even then, Ukraine denied attacking it. Last year, the Crimean bridge attack was followed by a counteroffensive, a successful one. So could this attack be a repeat? Well, this time the counterattack is already underway. Ukraine began the operation last month. Just one problem, though. It's all gone wrong. Reports say Ukraine has lost 20% of their weapons in the first weeks. 20% wiped out. And remember, these were not Ukraine's own weapons. These were weapons given to them by NATO. So what did Ukraine do? Reports say they have paused. They're rethinking their strategy. Who knows? Maybe sabotage is the new one. If so, it seems to have backfired because Russia says it has decided to halt the Black Sea grain deal. Some context here. The Black Sea grain deal was struck last year. It permitted Ukraine to ship food grains despite the war. That deal was set to expire today. Ukraine wanted to extend it, but Russia has refused. Now, Moscow did not link it to the Crimea attack, but I'm guessing it did not help. What does this decision mean for all parties involved? Ukraine could end up losing a lot of money, no grain shipments, so no payments. The rest of the world could be in trouble too. Ukraine is one of the biggest grain producers in the world. They make up around 9% of all wheat exports. If that wheat is stuck in ports, prices will rise. There will be more inflation. Until now, the Black Sea grain deal has kept things at bay. Food prices had fallen 20% after this deal was signed last year. So if Russia does not make a U-turn, grain importers will be in trouble, especially those in Africa, which makes you wonder, what is the point of all this fighting? How does all of it end? Well, one thing's for sure, the war has single-handedly discredited most so-called strategic experts. They said Russia would win within weeks. It's day 509. They said Putin would be weakened by the Wagner mutiny. Turns out the Wagner chief had a meeting with the Russian president, and that 2 days after the mutiny. My point is, forget the experts. Look at the battlefield reality. Russia is not losing this war at any cost, but neither is Ukraine winning. It has reached a violent and costly stalemate. The problem is, neither side will admit it. The U.S. National Security Advisor was asked this question on Sunday. Has the war reached a stalemate? That was the question. He said no. But the counteroffensive is hard. And what is Russia saying? President Putin is showing appetite for more escalation. He has threatened to use cluster bombs in Ukraine. Listen to this.
I'd like to note that the Russian Federation has a sufficient stockpile of different types of cluster munitions. Different types. We haven't done this before. We didn't use them and we didn't have to, despite of a known lack of munitions at a certain period of time. We didn't do it. But of course, if they are used against us, we reserve the right to take reciprocal action.
So what next? Now would be the right time for talks to discuss terms with Russia. Both sides are reeling from battleground losses. Their people and economies are tired. Now, I know what you're thinking. If the idea was to talk, why wait until now? Why not in March last year when Russia invaded? Because now Ukraine has sent a strong and clear message. It has shown that it's not a pushover. With the right weapons, Ukrainians can and will defend themselves. And Russia knows this pretty well by now. And Kyiv knows that Putin was not bluffing. He was serious about the NATO red line then, and he's serious about it now. Both sides need to start engaging, because this war is not going to be settled in the battlefield. It needs a political settlement. Vantage continues after a short break.
up. I should preface this by saying that, to be honest, right from the days when I used to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, I took the line that there is no such thing as a BJP foreign policy or a Congress foreign policy. There's only India's foreign policy and India's national interests. And when it comes to our place in the world, we're all Indians, and I see it that way. So I want to stress to begin with that I'm not sort of suddenly turning out to be a lovey-dovey voice, but on foreign policy, I think by and large, and I used to be a critic at the beginning of the Modi administration of some of their failings, but I think they've really...
Have you seen the new Mission Impossible movie? It is in the theatres. It is making a lot of buzz. If you've not seen it yet, spoiler alert. Tom Cruise, who plays Ethan Hunt, is back to saving the world from yet another villain. But this time, the villain is not a mad scientist or a ruthless assassin. It's artificial intelligence, or AI. I won't give out the whole plot, but it tells you how AI is everywhere now. It is writing essays, editing photos, composing songs, and even choosing military targets. Israel is doing it apparently, using artificial intelligence to select targets for military strikes. It is slowly embedding AI systems in its operations. So how does it work? Well, first you feed in a huge amount of data. Everything from drone and CCTV footage to satellite imagery, electronic signals and online communications. Basically, every form of intelligence you have. You feed all of it. The machine goes through all of it. It crunches the data, and in the end, it comes up with a list of targets to strike. Basically, a list of targets that the machine recommends. And the AI model does not just select targets, it also plans the operation for you. Once you have these targets set, another AI model jumps into action. This one is called the Fire Factory. So this AI model, the Fire Factory, takes these military-approved targets. It calculates the load of ammunition needed. It sorts them by priority. It assigns targets to aircraft and drones. And then it gives a whole schedule for the strikes. Sounds like a complete package, right? From locking targets to handling the logistics. Right now, these machines are not functioning autonomously. Every strike that the AI model suggests is being vetted and approved by a human. But this is not Israel's first time using AI in warfare. The biggest example was the Gaza war of 2021. Tel Aviv called it the first AI war. It used artificial intelligence to identify launch pads and deploy drones. So they've been doing it for a while. This latest move is being seen as an expansion, a new frontier in AI warfare. It may sound like an exciting development, but it also raises some very important questions. First is that of accountability. What happens if the machine orders a wrong strike? The IDF for the Israeli Defense Force argues that the targets are vetted by humans. But this is just the nascent stage. What happens when these systems become fully autonomous? Who do you blame for a wrong strike? The machine or the developer? Or will you blame the officials who deployed it? Can a machine really decide who lives and who dies? That's one question. The second question is, how reliable are these systems? AI models work on the data they're fed. What if this data is flawed or biased? The end result will also be flawed. Also, how secure are these systems? What if they're hacked? What if an enemy gains control of them? It would spell disaster. Imagine rogue strikes on your own people. It sounds like a bad nightmare, but it's very much a possibility. Because our world is moving towards lethal autonomous weapons, aka killer robots. Those that can identify and kill targets without human help. Sounds ominous. Thankfully, we're not there yet. But there have been instances where machines acted on their own. For example, what happened in 2020, armed drones are said to have killed a human for the first time. In 2020, the details are still sketchy, but this is according to the United Nations. A Turkish-made Kargu-2 drone hunted down members of Libya's national army. The manufacturer says the drone can classify objects, and this allows it to fire autonomously. So the days of killer robots are not far away, which brings us to another question. Do we have rules in place to manage them? And we are not the only ones raising these questions. The United Nations Security Council is doing the same. They will meet in New York on the 18th of July. On the agenda is a formal discussion on AI. Governments want to see how they can regulate it. And this is not a new conversation. The United Nations has been pushing to ban killer robots for some time now, but countries like the United States and Russia are not on board. They say instead of a ban, there should be guidelines. And it's not every day that the US and Russia agree on something. Guess it takes killer robots to unite them. But ban or no ban, there is still no international law that regulates the use of AI in warfare. In fact, there is no single international law to regulate AI. So how do we avoid an existential disaster? Killer robots are no longer fiction. And this isn't the first time the world is facing a new technology. What we need is consensus and regulation, hopefully before the damage is done. Now let's talk about Jammu and Kashmir. In a few weeks from now, it will hit a major landmark. 4 years since the scrapping of Article 370, a much contested move. It changed the identity of Jammu and Kashmir from a state to a union territory. It was a political, social and security challenge. There was intense scrutiny, both at home and outside. But 4 years on, the move seems to be paying off. Kashmir is getting foreign investment. It played host to a G20 meeting. It has seen a record number of tourists. And its local industries are being revived. Tonight, we bring you one such story of revival, the saffron trade. It's blooming again. This exotic spice of Kashmir now has a GI tag, and prices have shot up by more than 60%. Here's a report.
This is Kashmiri saffron. Many call it the red gold, mainly because it's priced just like real gold. 1 kilogram of the spice can cost up to $4,000. The saffron is part of every royal feast. It has caught the imagination of chefs, aficionados of luxury, even makers of traditional medicine for centuries. Kashmiri saffron was sought after around the world, and its producers enjoyed worldwide recognition. But the king of spices was on the verge of extinction. This is the home of Kashmiri saffron, Pampore, a tiny town right outside the capital city of Srinagar. Many buyers of saffron called Pampore the capital of saffron. More than 20,000 families farm it. They cultivate the saffron completely by hand. They plant the saffron flower between July and September. Roughly 8 weeks later, they pluck the flowers and separate each saffron strand by hand. It takes as many as 150,000 flowers to produce 1 kilo of saffron. The process is labor-intensive. Plus, the saffron cannot grow anywhere. The saffron flower is delicate. It's usually planted at an altitude of over 1,600 meters. That's why the Kashmiri saffron is so expensive. In recent decades, the process became a liability. Since the late 1990s, there was a rapid decline in production. Locals claimed the land for cultivation was shrinking, and climate change rapidly eroded the soil. Frequent droughts and falling water levels destroyed its fertility. By 2018, production dropped by over 60%. Competition from Iran worsened the situation. It's believed the Iranians brought saffron to Kashmir. In the modern day, they still dominate the global trade. 90% of the world's saffron is made in Iran. Iran's domination became a challenge for Kashmiri producers. They were being undercut in the market by cheaper saffron from Iran. It was being passed off as Kashmiri saffron. The real product was losing its ground fast, and Kashmiri farmers were losing hope. The government attempted a rescue. In 2010, a national saffron mission was launched. $57 million were poured to teach saffron farmers new cultivation methods, but the initiative failed. The turnaround came in 2020. The fix was a new piece of technology, a geographical indication or GI tag. This is a first for the saffron industry. The GI tag became the new identity of the Kashmiri saffron. For buyers, the tag was a hallmark of quality. It's given only after a batch passes quality checks. The GI tag has restored trust. It helped in fighting off the competition and verifying the product's authenticity. The buyers are now making a beeline. Earlier this month, the Kashmiri saffron became 5 times more expensive than silver. About 10 grams of spice was trading at around $40. Despite the steep prices, buyers from lucrative markets like the US, Europe and Canada are picking up Kashmir's saffron again. In a short span of time, the humble GI tag has secured 3 wins. It has helped in building trust, re-establish the market for the Kashmir saffron, and put the valley back on the world map.
The thing about saffron, it's really expensive, among the costliest spices out there. But then again, not like saffron is the foundation of human rights and freedoms. That would be democracy. But guess what? Like saffron, democracy too is becoming expensive. Specifically American democracy. Let me explain. Joe Biden's campaign has released its financial data. Get ready to be shocked. The campaign raised $72 million in the second quarter of this year, $72 million in 3 months. Put together, the campaign has around $77 million in cash. Biden's rivals are nowhere near. Donald Trump's campaign has raised around $35 million in the same period. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis raised $20 million. You may think that's a lot of money, but by next year, these numbers will be even higher. Let's look at 2020, the last election year, the presidential election. Biden's campaign raised $1 billion. It was a first in US election history, $1 billion of campaign money. Trump's campaign raised around $774 million. Where did all of this money come from? Until 2010, campaign money came from direct donations. But then came a US Supreme Court judgment. The court said corporations must also be allowed to donate. If not, it would restrict freedom of speech. You can imagine what happened next. Corporate America flooded all election campaigns. In 2020, total spending for the presidential race was $5.7 billion. For Congress, it was $8.7 billion. Put together, the total expense was $14.4 billion. Let me put that number in perspective. The GDP of 70 countries, 70 countries, is less than $14 billion. In other words, the US spends the GDP of 70 countries to elect lawmakers. Afterwards, they call them public servants. The humble people devoted to serving the public. There are 2 problems with that trend. One, the ridiculous numbers. It doesn't matter if you're the richest country in the world, $14 billion is too much money. Democracy should not cost that much. And 2, the influence that comes with this kind of money. In 2016, the NRA donated around $30 million to Donald Trump. What is the NRA? The National Rifle Association. It's a major pro-gun lobby in the US. They donated a lot of money to Donald Trump. And guess what Trump did after coming to office? He made it easier to buy guns. Imagine this happening across state legislatures and Congress. Each lawmaker funded by some sort of interest, maybe anti-abortion or pro-guns or anti-climate action, tells you why America is facing so many political divides. The democracy is built on money. If big corporations want to, they can make anyone the US president. If not Biden or Trump, then someone else. The question is, where is this money going? Now, some expenses are understandable. For example, travel. The US is the 4th largest country by area, so covering each state and city will be expensive. It will cost money. But what about the advertisements? A huge chunk of the expense is for running television and social media ads. Again, I have some numbers for you. In the 2022 midterm elections, around $6.4 billion was spent on ads. $6.4 billion. It's become a race of sorts. Who can take out more advertisements and smear campaigns? The US media does not bother to question this. And why would they? After all, they are the ones getting all this ad money. It's the perfect vicious circle. The fact is, big corporates have turned American democracy into a spectacle. Just think about it. Where else do you have 2-year-long campaigns and made-for-TV debates? Or unrestricted corporate donations or television networks calling elections and deciding the winner? It's not about counting the votes, it's about counting the dollars. And for the record, other countries have done much better. In the last UK general election, the Conservatives spent $20 million. That's it, $20 million for the party's greatest victory since 1987. Canada, too, has done better. Their entire general election cost around $650 million. It's a lot, but nothing compared to $14 billion. And what about India? The 2019 general election cost around $8 billion. This includes campaign spending and organizational costs. Now, some context here. The US is around 170 million voters. India has around 940 million. At first glance, the costs seem justified. But we should keep an eye on the trajectory. Election expenses in India have increased sixfold in the last 2 decades. We can't let this figure run away. In the US, that's exactly what has happened. Democracy and elections became commoditized in America, a spectacle for everyone to make a buck. In Pakistan, the Prime Minister is stepping down. Shehbaz Sharif has confirmed this. He will leave office before his term concludes. So elections should take place sometime in November. This gives Sharif and his party an extra month to prepare for polls. In the meantime, his administration is having a fire sale, with airports up for grabs, apparently. We're talking about the Islamabad International Airport. Reports say Pakistan is in a rush to outsource it. A meeting was held on Saturday, and outsourcing this airport was listed as a priority. They want to do it before Sharif steps down. What explains this rush? Our next report has the answer.
What do you think when you hear the term public sector enterprise? A poorly run, bureaucratic nightmare is what most often comes to mind. While that's not the case everywhere, it can be used to describe Pakistan's aviation industry. In recent years, they've had to suspend about 150 pilots flying with dubious licenses. Their national carrier has been banned from flying to the US, UK and Europe. And the airports really aren't being run efficiently, especially the Islamabad International Airport in the country's capital. It opened in 2018 and is already said to be outsourced. The reason is obvious. Pakistan is facing a major economic crisis, so the government needs money by any means possible, including the outsourcing of airport operations. The country is prepared to outsource airport operations for at least 25 years. They're looking for international partners to come and run the airports and make them efficient. 3 airports were initially lined up for this treatment: airports in Islamabad, Karachi and Lahore. The process to find partners began back in March, but there have been no takers so far. So, in a last-ditch attempt to make some kind of progress, Pakistan's aviation ministry has decided to prioritize the privatization. A meeting was held on Saturday and new deadlines were issued. Why the war footing to outsource the airport? As we said earlier, Pakistan really needs the cash. It has recently secured loans from the International Monetary Fund and Saudi Arabia. It is likely to get some money from the UAE as well, but all this still won't be enough to cover Pakistan's foreign debt payments. The country has a $22 billion loan commitment just this year. So any step that will help bring in money is welcome. As we mentioned, Pakistan is looking for international partners. That's because it needs foreign exchange. A foreign partner means the airport outsourcing will rake in dollars instead of the volatile Pakistani rupee. This will go a long way to help Pakistan during the economic crisis. But of course, to bring in foreign partners, Pakistan needs to clean up its act. There's a reason the airports aren't running as efficiently as possible. In a nutshell, it's because of too much involvement by the government. So Pakistan is looking to separate the functions of the government, airlines and airport services. You know, make them commercially viable airports instead of nepotism chambers for government officials. To this end, the Pakistani government wants to amend some laws by the end of the month. This could help restart flights to the West and so make Pakistan's aviation industry more attractive to foreign entities. But there could be another reason for the airport outsourcing rush. It may be seen as the government being financially responsible. That's not a bad memory to leave voters with just before an election. Pakistan is due to have a general election this November. It's a month later than it should happen. But that's by design, because the ruling party will want time to lay the groundwork for a grand return. The return of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. When Shehbaz Sharif announced that he would step down early, he also teased his big brother's return. He said that Nawaz Sharif would change the destiny of the country if brought back to power. And the government has already undone Nawaz Sharif's lifetime disqualification from office. This was by amending electoral laws. The next step is to make the party popular enough to ensure Nawaz Sharif is elected. Will outsourcing the airport and all the other recent fiscally prudent moves be enough to win the Pakistani people's trust? We'll have to wait till November to find out.
And there they go. It looks like
The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting. And speaking of struggles, let me ask you something. Have you heard about the boiling frog syndrome? It comes from a fable, and this is what it says. You put a frog into a pot of boiling water, and the frog jumps right out. But if you put it in a pot of nice tepid water, then gradually turn on the heat, the frog gets complacent and it boils to death because it doesn't feel the difference until it's too late. This story is an urban myth, and a morbid one at that. But I bring it up tonight because it reminds me of a real-world problem: climate change. Our world is in hot water, massive floods, extreme ocean temperatures, record heat, forest fires burning out of control, pluming smoke. A decade ago, any one of these events would have been an aberration. But now they're all happening, and happening simultaneously. There is a new climate disaster every day, and as depressing as it is, this is our new normal. Don't believe me? Well, brace yourselves for some truth bombs. If you're in Europe, things are really heating up. Hot weather alerts have been issued for over a dozen cities. This week, the hottest ever temperature is expected. If you're in the US, you and about 63 million others will face dangerous levels of heat. About 113 million people, that's a third of Americans, are currently under heat advisory. Specifically, if you're in the US, you and about 63 million others will face dangerous levels of heat. About 113 million people, that's a third of Americans, are currently under heat advisory. Specifically, if you're in California, it's going to get really bad. The Death Valley here is one of the hottest places in the world. It's nearing the hottest temperatures ever recorded on Earth. If you're in Canada, wildfires are ravaging the land. About 24 million acres have already burned. Smoke has enveloped many parts of the country. This may become the worst ever wildfire season. And stay with me because this is not all. Let's take you to Asia. Japan has issued heat stroke alerts affecting tens of millions of people. Many parts of the country are witnessing near record high temperatures. Meanwhile, other areas have been pummeled by torrential rain. Two extreme weather events in one country. If you're in India, you're probably braving floods and landslides caused by climate change-induced monsoon. And in South Korea, floods have killed at least 40 people. Meanwhile, if you live in China, a severe tropical storm is expected as a typhoon is set to make landfall. Overwhelmed? I get it. You're not alone. But my intention is not to flood you with climatic nerves, nor am I bringing you a weather report. My one and only point is quite simple. No matter where you are, which part of the world, climate alarm bells are ringing, and it's time to wake up and hear them. Because this boiling pot is only getting hotter. And with each passing day, we have a bigger price to pay. I'm talking about the cost of climate change. By 2050, it will have cost the world economy $23 trillion. Over the next 5 decades, this amount will increase to $178 trillion, and some nations will be paying a heavier price than others. Our next report tells you more.
A decade ago, this may have been just another balmy day. Today, it's a deadly heat wave. This could once have been a typical summer storm. Today, it's the cause of a fatal flood. This is the result of human-caused climate change. It's making disasters worse than ever before. We finally understand the risks this poses, how it is testing survival. But we are only now coming to terms with its economic effects. We finally understand how a warmer planet could mean a big hit to GDP. Where do the costs come from? Hotter temperatures cause crop yields to decrease. Floods destroy infrastructure like roads, which must be rebuilt. Old power grids are unable to withstand extreme climate, so new ones will have to be built, costing hundreds of millions of dollars. These are only a few examples. Climate change poses great economic issues, and by 2050, it could shave off about 14% of global economic output. That's a loss of about $23 trillion by 2050. As climate change worsens, so will the economic costs. Within 5 decades, this amount will increase to $178 trillion. But remember, these numbers are world totals. You see, climate change does not treat everyone as equal. By 2050, the US could lose 7% of its potential economic output. Canada, Britain, France could lose 6% to 10%. These are wealthy Western nations. For poorer nations, the consequences will be worse. They will face warmer temperatures, but will have lesser ability to adapt their infrastructure. Their climate response will suffer, so their economies will take a bigger hit. Malaysia, the Philippines and Thailand could lose 20% of their estimated wealth. The economy of India could be 35% smaller, and Indonesia's economy could be 40% smaller. Big economic losses. But don't be mistaken, they're not reserved for the future. Climate costs are already shrinking our economies. Last year, Pakistan saw devastating floods. It cost them $40 billion in damages. In 2021, floods in India caused losses of $3 billion. The US is increasingly spending over $1 billion on weather disasters. Back in 1980, the average time between billion-dollar disasters was 82 days. But last year, it was just 18 days. The US saw 22 such billion-dollar disasters. Climate change is unleashing catastrophes. Experts say in the near future, today's disasters will seem mild. And it's clear that this will have ripple effects on our economies. So brace for more turbulence.
Wimbledon has 2 new champions, Marketa Vondrousova and Carlos Alcaraz. Vondrousova is 24 years old, the first unseeded player to win the women's title. She was a total surprise. Last year, she was a tourist in London, nursing an injury. This year, she is a Wimbledon champion. It doesn't get better than this. Then you have Carlos Alcaraz, the 20-year-old men's champion. Both Vondrousova and Alcaraz are young, but that's where the similarities end. Alcaraz is the world #1. He won his first Grand Slam last year, the US Open. He is the ringleader of the new generation. The new brigade has been waiting in the wings for some time now. Federer, Nadal and Djokovic have ruled tennis longer than anyone would have imagined. Sample this. The last time Wimbledon had a men's champion outside the Big Four, Andy Murray being the 4th one, was in the year 2002. Over 2 decades ago. Alcaraz was not even born then. 3 out of the 4 big are still playing. Only Federer has retired. While it seems like the next generation is finally ready to take its place in the sun, the question is, why has it taken them so long? You see, any sport is highly competitive, but an individual sport is also isolating. While it takes a village to raise a champion, the player is all alone in the sporting battlefield. You persevere and perish, all alone on that tennis court. So it isn't just the physical battle, it's also a mental one. The gladiators of the sport, like Djokovic and Nadal, are known for this. As much for their physical prowess as for their mental acuity. You get nervous watching your favorite players play. Imagine the pressure on them. One shot could make all the difference. One shot stands between your lifelong dream and years of struggle. And talent alone will not get you there. You have to be made of sterner stuff. Djokovic comes from war-torn Serbia. Nadal has played with a broken thumb. Andy Murray plays with a metal hip. Federer has put in the hours, day after day, despite his prodigious talent. Monica Seles was stabbed on court while she was unstoppable. While the stabbing derailed her career, it did not deter her from making a comeback. Serena Williams won a Grand Slam while she was pregnant. Her 43-year-old sister Venus still plays, even with an autoimmune disease which causes joint pain and fatigue. It's a long list, I could go on. In professional sport, giving up is not an option. Not even when you're losing. Not even when it's a case of so close yet so far. Not even when you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Not even when the tank is completely empty. Forgive me if I sound like a Nike ad, but champions just keep on going. Take Djokovic, for instance. Right after losing the Wimbledon final, he talked about a new rivalry with Alcaraz. Imagine the 36-year-old talking of a rivalry with a 20-year-old. Last evening's men's final was poignant for another reason. It had a sense of déjà vu, of Wimbledon 2008. Federer was the defending champion then, just as Djokovic was now. And another Spaniard ended his reign. In 2008, it was Rafael Nadal. In 2023, it is Carlos Alcaraz. Alcaraz, like Nadal, is considered a clay court specialist, but on Sunday he changed that, taking even his opponent by surprise. And that's another thing about champions. Old or young, they have to keep reinventing themselves, adapting to different challenges. Because if the road to the top is tough, staying there is even tougher. And even then, no matter how good you are, someday someone will replace you, in sport as in life. I started by saying that the women's winner, Marketa Vondrousova, went on from being a tourist to a champion. The reverse happened to the great Roger Federer. He won the Wimbledon 8 times, the most by any man. But this year, he visited as a spectator. If Vondrousova's tale is the stuff of fairy tales, Federer's is Newton's law. The rule of life, what goes up must come down. The only difference between the good and the great is the journey in between, and how to make it count. So for Carlitos, as he likes to be called because he doesn't want to feel grown up apparently, the real struggle has only just begun. That is the burden of greatness. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. A group of scuba divers spotted an extremely rare creature called the oarfish off the coast of Taiwan. The fish was found with mysterious holes on its body. Last week, India made history by launching Chandrayaan-3. Some people got a chance to witness this moment from a plane. Meanwhile, the FIFA Women's World Cup 2023 will begin soon. An acrobatic skydiver unfurled its banner over New Zealand's Auckland and landed in Eden Park. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day, in 1936, the Spanish Civil War began. Troops initiated the uprising under the leadership of General Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union supported Republicans who stood by the Spanish government. Nazi Germany supported the nationalists who favored the military rather. Ultimately, the nationalists won. We're leaving you with that. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Naked horror inflames the whole of space, and still the burning, fighting, killing go on in the desperate battle for power. The communist salute is used by everybody in Bus, and the government, though not communist itself, is used. After a hasty training of 5 days, recruits are rushed to the front. No one can move either way without a pass. The Paramount cameraman shows his. He is allowed through.
Lift off normal.
people, not just 100, I think it's more like 200 meetings, 58 cities, 32 work streams. So they suddenly made the G20 a kind of buzzword in India in a way that other countries that have hosted G20 meetings had failed to do. So full credit to India for seizing the opportunity, sort of pushing it as a kind of people's G20 by involving youth groups and civil society groups and think tanks. All of that's happened. And definitely it has, you know, put India sort of on the consciousness of these 20 countries and their senior officials and ministers beyond any shadow of a doubt. And I think that's been quite remarkable. I think in many ways for India, it's one more sort of aspect of our soft power. You can take people to Hampi and to Srinagar and you showcase our diversity, you showcase so many aspects of our rich culture and so on. That helps. And to my mind, I've been a long advocate of soft power as India's strength, and I think this was one very good example of it.
Let's talk about hard power. I was there in the US when the Prime Minister visited a few weeks back. We had the recent visit to France, all the defense deals, the big tech deals. Do you see a sense in global capitals that they see India as the country to take a long bet on?
Oh yeah, I don't think that anyone feels they can afford to ignore India. That's out of the question. That's been evolving since the beginning of the century. And I would say that what's interesting is that it straddled both parties in our system and all governments in major countries. In other words, of course, Russia's only had Mr. Putin, but if you look at America, they've had Republican and Democratic presidents. We've had in France a series of different administrations. But right across, there's been the sense that India is a force to be reckoned with on the world stage, a country that must be taken seriously. And I think that the government has done well to work assiduously at it and take this up. I should preface this by saying that, to be honest, right from the days when I used to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, I took the line that there is no such thing as a BJP foreign policy or a Congress foreign policy. There's only India's foreign policy and India's national interests. And when it comes to our place in the world, we're all Indians, and I see it that way. So I want to stress to begin with that I'm not sort of suddenly turning out to be a lovey-dovey voice, but on foreign policy, I think by and large, and I used to be a critic at the beginning of the Modi administration.
Namaste, everybody. Namaste, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you.
So the CNN News 18 town hall comes back into the national capital on a day where we have a town hall happening in your uru, sir, Bengaluru.
Let's call it a town hall. If you want to equate what's going on here with the group of people who are trying desperately to be relevant in Bengaluru, you did it, I didn't do it. Look, this is a democracy. People are free to do what they want to do. People are free to align with who they want to align with. And people are also free to be deluded into believing that they can do something that they cannot. So it's fine.
You believe it's a delusion, but a Congress is ready to back an AAP ordinance in Delhi. Those who got ousted are now coming together. They seem to be determined to keep the BJP out.
Look, I'm not approaching this as a minister or as a politician, but just as common sense tells me that if your entire unity, if you want to call it that, is about disliking one person, and that you do have nothing positive to offer to 1.2 billion Indian, 1.3 billion Indians who are all very anxious now, keen to see India develop, continue the type of development that we have seen in the last 9 years. And all you have is essentially gali galoch, as they say in Hindi, or fear-mongering and appeasement. If that's all you have in 2023 after 76 years of independence, then I think the people of India will certainly speak in 2024 as they have in 2019 and as they have in 2014. And the people of India know exactly what the future holds for them, what the opportunities are, and what the potential of this great nation is now unfolding in front of their eyes. And I can't imagine anybody who's a right-thinking person, who cares about his family, will ever want to derail this momentum or slow down this momentum in any way, just because a group of people who between them cannot succeed think that sum of a few zeros is more than a zero.
But wherever the opposition has consolidated,